it's hard to get people to take ownership, like that struggle with how do I get people to take accountability, take ownership of their job, and really own what they do in a way that we don't have to feel like we're having to micromanage people.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Contractor Success Academy. Today, we've got a great lesson lined up. Vicki Suiter is in the studio. Vicki, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Mark. I'm excited to be here.
So are we. We're glad to have you. Now, Vicki, you are very accomplished, a consultant, author. You wrote the book, The Profit Bleed. Profit Bleed, that's a very scary thought. We can talk about that at the end of the presentation. You're also a speaker, and you've had your company, Suiter Business Builders, for close to 30 years now?
Yes.
So you have, suffice to say, you've seen your fair share of home improvement, contractor businesses, and your expertise, your skill set is in building teams, right? Successful teams, right? If you want your team to do something, you want them to take ownership, I think that's where you come in, right?
It is. Well, how I look at it is that, what I say is I help people increase their profits, have more time in their day, and reclaim the joy in what they do again. And what I found is the most direct path to doing that is to build a company with A players and build a kind of organization that great people want to work for. So that is like a very big part of the work that I do in helping people get aligned and build great teams. But it's like it's a whole organization approach to being able to do that. So,
yeah, interesting. Well, I'm excited. It's the type of thing that I think, having a system is definitely worth it. A lot of people go at it haphazardly and realize later on that, managing people, building teams, building culture, getting that business to run smoothly, it's not easy. So anything that can help.
Well, and it's funny because I think a lot of times people think that it is challenging, and I think most people would say that it is a challenge for them. And I've surveyed people and they've said that, and clients have said that. What's interesting, though, is that I don't think that it requires having a degree in management or HR or anything like that. When you, as you said, and I appreciate what you said, because like when you have the systems can be your guide for being able to navigate your way with your team as partners, as opposed to, I got to be the guru with all the answers and I've got to, be the cheerleader all the time. And that's just really not true. So I think you're right. It's like if you get the good systems in place and you treat it like it's a process that you're working on as an organization, it becomes so much easier.
Yeah. To me, the word that comes to mind is empowerment, to empower your team when you're not, like you say, having to be the cheerleader, the leader, whatever it is. You see the people take accountability, ownership, and make things happen. Mm-hmm. That's when you can take that sigh of relief and say, wow, things are happening. We've got, So I'm going to stop talking. Without further ado, let's have you share your screen and let's get into the presentation.
All right, here we go. So today's topic that we're going to talk about is how do you have conversations that get results? And the topic that, the conversation that Mark and I were just having about this whole thing about how do you get consistent results with your team? And a lot of times the thing that we hear or the thing that we experience as a manager or a leader is that it's difficult to get consistent results from your team. And what it often looks like is I keep having conversations with people and I keep telling them what to do, or we keep talking about things, but things don't seem to change. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And how do you shift that and start having conversations that produce consistent results? So, one of the things is you may have noticed, and have you ever experienced this as a leader, is it's hard to get people to take ownership, like that struggle with how do I get people to take accountability, take ownership of their job, and really own what they do in a way that we don't have to feel like we're having to micromanage people. And the other thing that I see a lot, and I've experienced too, is does it seem like you tell somebody to do something and it seems like they said yes, but they don't seem to retain it. Like it doesn't go in, or they've made an agreement, but they're not keeping that agreement, which is the other thing. It's like, do you ever wonder why people don't follow through? Do you ever wonder why they don't keep their agreements? And what I found is that there's a reason that that happens. And when you can understand why that is, then you can start to change that. And when I surveyed managers, 65% of the managers I surveyed said that if you answered any of those questions, like you wish your team took more ownership, so do most other managers. So you're not alone. And 45% of those people said that they wished they were better at managing people. And it's like what Mark and I were talking about a minute ago. We think that it's some magic formula that we have to be cheerleaders or we have to be some other person than we are in order to be a good leader and a manager. And that's really not true. If you have the right mindset and you have the right systems and tools in place, you can start to shift that in your company so that you actually get people to take more ownership in a way that isn't manipulative and isn't requiring you to be on them all the time. So we're going to talk about that today. And you're going to learn about how to get more consistent results from your team. I'm going to show you some tools that can really help you do that and that I've seen definitely has helped me in my business with my team, but has also helped tons of my clients create amazing transformations in their business and their ability to build really strong A players and to build the kind of organization where people all take ownership and responsibility in their job. And you're going to find out about how to get people to follow through on their agreements. So I'm going to share with you a tool that I use and a little acronym that you're going to find will be helpful for you remembering how to get people to start to make better agreements with you and then follow through on those agreements.
And Vicki, that tool is not a whip, right?
No, it is not a whip. Yeah, it's not like, we don't do that. Okay. So thank you, because it's without manipulation or admonishing people, and it's not without, it's without all of that, the word that comes to mind is yuckiness about managing people. So it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be, the whole carrot and stick and whip approach. So I can relate to all of those things. I will say that I have been there, and my early years as a manager were super painful. When I first started my business, I had come from a corporate background where I had a team of 9 people. And honestly, I was very glad to not be managing 9 people anymore. And all I had to do was to count on me to deliver a result. And about 4 years into starting, I noticed that I was working back again to 50, 60 hours a week. And at that point, I had a young son at home. And I realized that I needed to make a choice of either I downsize and not grow my business, which wasn't in my plan at all, or I had to hire somebody. And I was nervous about it because I had not had a great experience managing people, but I was also feeling like, well, this is my business. And did I have the ability to hire somebody who was going to be able to do what I did and deliver the kind of service to clients and keep up with their agreements and do everything that they needed to make sure to represent me well? And so, but I was at that like struggle place of, but I got to do it. I've got to make that choice and start to move forward. So I wrote down everything I wanted somebody to do, interviewed a bunch of people. And I came across Beth, who, when we sat down and I interviewed her, I just really liked her a lot. She had the experience that I was looking for. She had the personality I wanted. She seemed to, we just hit it off. Like we had a really good connection with each other. And I thought, well, this is perfect. This is going to be great. And so Beth started, I spent a couple of weeks going over with her all of, our clients and what's the work that the clients, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen just for a minute. And I want to just share the story with you. So as I, we started working together and introducing her to clients and getting her adjusted to, here's your task list of everything that you need to do. And then within about 3 weeks, I sent her out on her own. And I was super relieved. And then about a week after she'd been out on her own, I got a call from a client who said, hey, when you're here, you ask us all kinds of questions, and Beth doesn't seem to be asking us any questions when she's here. And I'm kind of concerned she's not, not covering all the bases. And so I kind of had this, conversation with Beth called, hey, would you make sure to ask more questions of the client when you're there? And then a couple of weeks later, it was a call from another client that said, hey, when you're here, before you leave, you always sit down and go through with us what we're supposed to be doing next and what you found and all that. And she's not doing any of that. And I'm concerned. Like, I feel like, it's kind of disconnected now that you're not in the loop. So then I had another conversation with her about that. And then, I noticed that when I would ask her for stuff, I was having to kind of like pull out of her, like what she did at the client's office. And I was started to feel really frustrated. And I'm like, gosh, I told her to do all these things and she doesn't seem to be doing it. And then I got a couple more calls from clients. And then I was like, something's not right here. And I was starting to get that uneasy feeling like I had when I had managed people before. And, something told me that there was something about how I was doing this that wasn't workable, but I didn't know what it was. And it was around that time that I was listening to I will share one other thing. I'm kind of this person that if I have the same breakdown over and over again with different people, even way back then, I had enough wherewithal to go, this is a really similar experience that I had when I was working for, this international training company with my team there. And I thought, well, maybe I just need to double down. So I started spending a whole bunch of time with Beth because I thought, well, maybe I just wasn't paying enough attention. So I would spend like an hour and a half going over with her all of what she did at the client's office after she got back from those meetings. And I was doing that like a couple times a week. Well, you kind of get the idea. Like within not very much time, I realized that I wasn't getting any advantage of having somebody work for me because now I was micromanaging everything she did and having to double check and double down on making sure that, did you meet with the client and did you do this and did you do that? Like I was having all these conversations and not having necessarily the results that I wanted because I wasn't always getting the answers I wanted, but also that I was spending way more time going over things with her and asking her questions about what she had done. And it was just ineffective. And so it was around all this time that, I'm starting to have this realization that I've not saved any time. And that was what this was supposed to do, was to give me more time. And I'm not getting the results that I want. And oh, by the way, this is very similar to the experience that I had before, which had me go, there's something that must be something I'm not doing right. And it was about that time that I was listening to or reading Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it was also around that time that I was reading Michael Gerber's The E-Myth. And so if you've read either of those books, they are both books about management leadership, about systems and processes, and about this whole thing about finding and empowering the best in the people who work for you, but also creating systems that will allow you to produce consistent results and stop having conversations that aren't working and start empowering your team to take ownership in a whole new way. And it was at that point that I realized that part of the problem with Beth is that, and had been the problem with my team before, was that I was treating her like she was a helper. Like I had given her a list of tasks to do, and I hadn't actually given her the results she needed to produce. So in other words, I had told her, well, you have to, you got to do this and you got to do that and you got to do this and you got to do that. But I wasn't saying to her, hey, when you come back to the office, what you need to do is to make sure that the client's completely informed about what it is that happened, that you produce a report that summarizes what's the result that you've created and what's the, what are the actions that you took about any breakdowns that occurred that you were seeing that needed to be fixed with the client. And I didn't have any of that in place. I was just trying to pull it out of her about what it is that she had done. And so, in that learning, and that whole time that sent me into this deep learning about how do you understand what motivates people? How do you understand about how to create a structure and a system for being able to produce consistent results with your team? And how do you do it without micromanaging people, and that you raise people up to the level of being partners with you as opposed to helpers? And as I learned in my business and started to implement that with Beth, I started to implement that with clients. And I continued to develop my learning about what motivates people. And what I have found is that what I'm going to share with you next are some of the pieces that really totally transformed my business and my relationship with Beth. She ended up working for me for over 10 years, was one of the best employees I ever had in the long run. And I've seen this with clients, where I have clients these days who, in a time when it's really hard to find good people to work for you, even qualified people, or even people who will just come work for you, I have clients who have people calling them for work because they've created an organization where they empower their team to take ownership in ways that they've built a culture that people love working for their companies. But part of that comes from, how do you shift from being somebody who micromanages tasks to someone who manages for results? So, and that's the way to have conversations that produce results. So I'm going to jump back in and I'm going to show my screen and we'll just walk through these.
I think that's an interesting story, Vicki, because a lot of people would kind of, not even consider the idea that they may have, not necessarily done their best at, supporting that candidate. And they point the finger and say, well, what I saw in the interview process is not what I'm seeing now. Take a hike. I'm going to find somebody else who can get it done. And so, yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's Mark, when one of the first questions I always ask a prospective client is, do you have position agreements or what's most people know as job descriptions in place in your company? And I get like probably 70% of the people say no, 30% of the people say yes. And when I look at the ones that say yes, they're usually what I had when I started with Beth and when I had my team before that, which is a task list, like a list of, you have to do this and you have to do that and you have to do that. But tasks are only a stepping stone to following a procedure that's about producing a result. And so like the shift was, and I'll give you some examples as we go along here, but that shift was, how do you start to shift to think differently and really think about, well, what's the result I want them to take ownership of, as opposed to what are the tasks that they have to do in order to produce that result? And that's where that paradigm completely shifted for me. And when I see people do that, there's so much freedom in that. But let's jump in and I'll just walk you through it. So the first step is to create clearly defined position agreements. And I define position agreements different than job descriptions for this reason. They are essentially the same, but when I do position agreements, I think of them more like they are agreements between you and your team, which is why I call them agreements. Like I treat them like contracts, just like you have contracts with customers that you work with when you do projects, that they are the contract and the agreement that you have between you and your team. And that they speak to results that are specific, and they're not just a bunch of tasks on a list. So in other words, what it does is it sets you and them up to know how to win the game together. So a example of that would be that, let's say if I have a position agreement for a project manager. So we know in the world of construction, it's all about on time, on budget, as promised. That's like the overall, like that's what we do as contractors. That's what a contractor's business is. And when you're a project manager, it's very much your accountability to be on time, on budget as promised. So then there are a lot of tasks that go into doing that, but there are certain results that drive the ability and are the key drivers, and what I call like the pulse points for being able to produce a project on time, on budget as promised. So instead of a position agreement or saying something like, your job is to bring projects in, and this is what I see a lot. Your job is to bring projects in on time and to make sure to keep the schedule updated and to keep the client informed and to make sure to, visit the site and make sure that everything is flowing smoothly and that you've got the right crews there, right? So those might be some of the things that I often see are just sort of like a bulleted list of here's all the things you have to do. But now let's just shift to that a little bit. So when I write position agreements, it's going to have some of those elements, but it's going to speak a little bit differently. It's going to say something like schedules are produced and updated every week and communicated to management and to the client. Or that budgets are in labor burn hours are reviewed every week and with a foreman and or the superintendent, depending on the structure of your business, and planned out for the weeks or months remaining on that project. Another one might be that cost to complete is done every month by the 5th of the month, and that projects out what the cost is to finish that project. So you might be noticing that one of the things that I'm talking as I'm speaking, that I'm speaking of specific and measurable and time-driven results. So why is that important? Because if I'm a project manager, if everything has equal weight, then I'm always got everything at the, and maybe you do this too, right? So like, I know I sometimes do this where we have everything loaded up at one time as being equally as important. But if we have a schedule that says, I got my month lined out and I know that I have certain things that are deliverables that are due at different time frames, I'm much better able to manage my time and manage the results I produce, as opposed to I don't have any deadlines. And so everything kind of is always loaded up, which makes me, when I've got it all whipping around in my head, I don't know about you, but I'm much less effective at what I do. So what I find is that when we start to measure that specifically for people about the what and the when, and what results or what standards you have for that. If it's a change order, do you want change orders turned around within 48 hours? We'll specify that in your position agreement. Now, change orders are going to have a whole separate procedure that has all the tasks involved in it that's outside of the job description. Because that's the other thing that happens sometimes. I notice people want to put a procedure in a position agreement. We'll keep it separate, right? So you have a whole procedure over here that says change orders are turned around and signed with or decided on within 48 hours, let's just say. Well, that's the standard or the stake in the ground that is the standard for your company that you've decided on. And there's a whole procedure that happens for that. That's outside of the job description of the position agreement. Within the position agreement, it says change orders are priced and turned around within 48 hours. And again, whatever that criteria is for you, that's going to vary greatly depending on the size of the project and if you're a general or a sub or whatever. So those are sort of some examples of how do you put into place a position agreement that is specific and measurable. And I'm going to show you a position agreement for a project manager so that you can see what it looks like, because that'll really help give you an idea of a little bit more specifically what a position agreement would look like. And when I lay out position agreements, I have them, basically there are 4 sections to this. And by the way, I'm going to give Mark the link and you'll get to be able to download an outline for how to write a position agreement for yourself so that you can implement what you're learning here. So I have 4 basic sections of a position agreement. So the first section is primary function, which is kind of what's an overall general statement of what that job is. And then there are what I recommend 5 to 7 major responsibilities. So these are the things that are, what are the major things this person is accountable for? And again, what this does is it starts to have me focus on, as I'm writing a position agreement, what are the really big chunk things? So it starts to move you out of that mindset of just that their job is to do tasks, and it has you start to focus on what are the big picture, bigger results that they're accountable for. And then the next section is skills and qualifications. This is what is the experience somebody has to have to do this job within my company. And then the next section is objectives and results. So objectives and results is where you're digging into what are the measurable specific results, like the example I just gave you about a change order or a schedule that I want this person to produce, that they will then, they know what they're accountable for. And so maintains daily communication with field and client, staff and client. That's pretty generic, right? But if I say, field reports are completed daily, right? So it's specific of a what and a by when. That labor is prepared with proper materials by 8 a.m. each day. It's specific and it's a by when, right? So when you're doing objectives and results, what you do is you take each of the major responsibilities and you answer this one question. How will I know it got done? So will I know it got done is your key prompting question that will help you identify what are the specific results. Now, so I notice when I do this process with people that a lot of times it's a little bit challenging sometimes to define the criteria, especially if you've not had a criteria set before in your company. So one of the first things that, people will say is well, we've never done that. Like we just like when you get it done. And part of what you're doing is in this process is in closing down the open-endedness of it to give it some standard for within your company. In other words, putting a stake in the ground to go, well, what's the standard? Because when you start to do that, you start to give somebody the ability to be able to manage their own time much more effectively. And when they can do that more effectively, so if I'm a project manager, now if that's really clear for me, then I can be clearer with my foreman and my superintendent. And if my foreman and my superintendent are super clear about it, then they're going to be clearer with the labor and the subcontractors on the job site. So now it gets a whole lot easier to be able to produce a project on time, on budget, as promised, when I've set the structure in the systems and the criteria for success in a way that everybody could look at it and measure it and know if it got done or not. So one of your little keys, besides asking the question, how will I know it got done, would be to ask the question, could it be measured by anybody and not just by me? So that's another way to look at it. So if you just keep those two things in mind, that'll really help you create position agreements with your team that are specific. So pretty much what I'm just describing here is how do you set up those specific measurable results? And this is what I did with Beth, is I shifted that position agreement with her so that it was based on what were the results I wanted her to produce, not what were all the tasks that needed to happen. What it also did is it required us to then sit down and create procedures, which we did together, about how do you do a review? How do you do this? How do you do that? And we created procedures that actually, so, I've been in business for 30 years now, right? So that was a while ago. I've had other people who I hired after that those procedures were invaluable, right? So they helped me be able to get somebody else up to speed very quickly and start operating at the system within our system in the way that we wanted the results to be produced. So it made it a win-win for anybody who came after her as well. So when you're doing this for the first time, keep in mind that, and as many times as I've done this with any company, there are always going to be things that you're asking people to do that you've not asked them to do before. There's always going to be standards that you're going to put in place that you haven't had before, procedures not written, and that's okay. It's just part of the process of making that change. And the cool thing I'll say is that whenever I've put position agreements in place, and I've seen this with client after client, that their teams are always so grateful for being able to have that clarity about how do I win the game with you? What's the criteria for success in my job? And I've gotten lots of feedback over the years about getting that feedback, that people are super appreciative of the fact that they now understand better how to manage their time and how to be successful at their job. That's huge. So just a recap on this. So the elements of a great position agreement is they speak to results, not task. There's measurable standards and they're agreed upon. So the agreed upon piece is that you want to have your team actually look at it when you do the position agreement, you want them to take a look at it and to be collaborative with you about, hey, is there anything I missed in here? Is there anything that you want to change? When my client Joe did this with his foreman, there were some standards that he put in there he had been a constant firefighter. He was always battling this whole conversation with his foreman about, they were calling him all day long every day about, I needed this and I don't have crew for that, and the materials didn't show up and the subcontractor's not here. And my client Joe, who was the operations manager, was like a little crazy every day because he felt like he was just constantly reacting. And so when we put position agreements in place with the foreman and started to define what was their accountability and what results they were responsible for, one of the things that was in there was for them to start doing 2-week look-aheads. And they had never done 2-week look-aheads before. And they didn't, and the procedure wasn't even written for it, for their company. And so as he implemented the position agreements, first of all, they all looked at it and looked at the draft. They all agreed on the final version of it. And when they were done, they were like, oh, this is so great. We really appreciate the specificity of what our job really is so that we're all on the same page. And then they started implementing the 2-week look ahead. Everybody was fine with, there was a new standard in place. They, realized that it was going to help them be more effective at their job. They were super frustrated with Joe by the fact that they were always kind of having to call him to get this stuff done anyway. And it took a while, so, I just want to acknowledge too, that when you start to put those new things in place, it took about 6 months to shift from them showing up with these blank 2-week look aheads to them showing up to the meetings every week with him where they had them filled out. So some part of this is, I just recommend that as you do it, that getting that buy-in and agreement is a really important piece to getting their willingness to make a change. And the change may take some time, but time's going to go anyway, right? So this is a great way for you to start to shift from I'm having conversations with people and not getting results to starting to shift to, well, let's set some standard and define the criteria of what success is and what are the results. Let's define it. Let's put it in writing. Let's get agreement about it. So the last piece of position agreements, and I said this a little while ago, is you actually literally want to have them sign it and treat it like this is our agreement with each other about what's the criteria for success in your job. And what I have found is that when we make agreements that are specific like that, we take our agreements much more seriously. So when you have it in writing, you've gotten buy-in, and then you get agreement, you get that agreement for them where they've actually signed off on it. Then you want to have it be a living document, something that you engage with and review people on and so on, which is a topic that's more time than we have time for today. But it's like then you want to manage against those results with your team. And there's a strategy for doing that. Again, we don't have time to go into it today, but that's your next step. But what this does is it sets by having those position agreements in place, it sets the foundation for being able to set up a game where people know how to win with you. They're managing for results. You stop micromanaging and trying to manipulate people to get results. And what you get is a more consistent result from people. And I have found this to be true over and over again with clients when they've implemented position agreements with their team.
I find it really interesting, Vicki, the fact that, when you put systems like this in place, the employee, it just becomes that there's almost a level of clarity that they have. It's not just, okay, it's, I've got this list of things that I need to do, but don't really know what the outcome is. How's it going to be measured? How will my performance be judged? So it becomes clear as day, and then they can almost self-assess, and it almost takes you as the business owner or the manager slightly out of the equation in that you almost don't have to come and say, hey, how come you're not doing this? What's going on? Like, or when you have those conversations, it's easier to have because you've got, your documents you can come back to and say, look, this is what we talked about. This is what we agreed upon. It's not happening.
Right.
And, nobody can say anything, right?
Yes. Well, and because now it's like we have an agreement. And what's the nice thing about, and I appreciate what you said about like being able to evaluate an employee against that, or they can self-evaluate against that position agreement, is that, often it's difficult for us to have those hard conversations with people when they're not getting their job done. Well, now if you've defined the criteria and it's measurable, and you have something over here that you've both agreed to and signed that's not about, I like you, I don't like you, you're good, you're bad, or any of that, weird stuff, but that it's about this agreement that we have, just like the contracts that you sign with clients. Now I'm managing and I'm holding myself accountable and I'm holding you accountable to the agreement that we have or the contract that we have. So now that becomes much more, and when you're clear about it, just like when you have a contract with a client, when you're clear about what your deliverable is, it's way easier to manage and hold the other person accountable to that deliverable, right? So it's no different that way. So let's talk about the last piece here, which is promises made, not kept. That whole thing of people make agreements, but that they don't then keep them. And one of the things that I have found works really well for addressing this is to start to make smart agreements with people. So smart agreements are, and probably a lot of people have heard that acronym before, it's specific, measurable, there's clear accountability, they're realistic, and they're time driven. So let's talk about an example of that. You're in a meeting with somebody. And I use this all the time, by the way, when I'm in meetings with clients. And a lot of my clients use this when they're in meetings with their team, that before you go into a meeting, because a lot of us feel like we waste a lot of time in meetings and don't get a lot of stuff done. Or, have you ever walked out of a meeting and you're like, wow, Joe said he was going to do that last week, but I don't believe that he's going to get it done because he's going to show up next week and it's not done. Or that you get really frustrated that people make agreements that they're going to do things, they show up to the next meeting, or the email that didn't come, but just stuff doesn't get followed through. And the reason that happens is that when there's not these things in place, when it's not specific, when it's not measurable, when there's not clear accountability, when they're not realistic, and when they're not time driven, then they become just open-ended things and they don't get done. And I don't know about you, maybe you've experienced this too, Mark, but I know for me, the stuff that I get done most effectively and consistently is when I have a deadline on it. So when I make agreements with people, I always say, here's when I'm going to have that done. Here's when I'm going to have that to you, because it closes the back door and also has people stop having to wonder when I'm going to do it, right? So it builds more trust in that relationship with that person.
Yeah, it's a commitment.
Yes. So let's talk about, specific, we've been talking a little bit about specific here. Specific is that there's something specifically that's going to get done. It's not general and vague. It's measurable. You can know whether or not it's going to get done, and anybody could measure whether or not it got done. There's clear accountability. Whose agreement is it? Who's actually, if a bunch of people say they're going to do something, and I'm in a meeting with them, I'll go, well, so who's going to be the one to take the lead and to drive this and make sure that you take accountability for it happening? Because if you got a group of 3 people and they all say, yeah, we'll do that, then I want to know who on the team is going to take ownership for making sure that it got done.
So in other words, who's taking the fall when this doesn't get done?
Well, much. I mean, but it's if there's not somebody who's accountable, then everybody goes, well, Joe, Steve didn't do it. Bob, Sue didn't do it. Everybody's pointing fingers. And then the other one is realistic. And this is super important. As managers and leaders, it's very important that we understand that people want to be a yes to us. And when we make a request, they want to say yes, and they want to please us. And I have had to learn, I'm somebody who, I say I'm a little bossy. And so I have to be very careful that when I make requests of people, that they're not actually veiled demands, that they're actually requests, and then I'm willing to hear no for an answer. And this is part of, our challenge as leaders is to learn how to, not have like, we just want it done. Like, we got something that needs to get handled, we want it done. And to be able to be in that place of negotiating maybe, or discussing, or really like questioning, if somebody's really swamped and they're going to say yes to you, you might just pause and go, is that really a yes? Because can you really get that done? Is it realistic? So I caution us as managers and leaders that we pay attention to when people are making what I affectionately call jerky promises. Like, that's just not really going to happen. So let's talk about like what's one piece of it maybe that you can do, which is where the specific part comes in. If it's a really big project, well, what piece are you going to have done by next Tuesday, which is where the time driven comes in. Make it, actionable, clear, realistic, and then time driven. And all of these sound easy, I'm going to say. But this is an interesting thing that takes time and practice. And it takes a little extra time at the beginning as you're building this communication style with people. But what you're going to find is that ultimately conversations happen quicker, results happen more consistently. People intrinsically want to keep agreements that they make. So when you ask them, when you start operating and making agreements with people based on using this acronym of making SMART agreements, you're going to find that people more consistently keep their agreements with you. I have found this to be true. And it can be uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable to have to say, so when will you have that done? Especially if it's a peer or if it's a boss. And I have gotten used to having this expression because I ask this of my clients. I ask this of their teams. I ask this of my teams. I always say, this is not a pressure question. This is just I want to manage my, I want to manage my understanding clearly about it, or my expectation. I don't want to have an unrealistic image of how this is going to happen. Can we just talk about that? When do you think that will get done? So you'll have it, and then I repeat it back. So you're going to have this done by this date, and it'll look like this. Or am I right about that? Yes, no, whatever, right? And then check, and then I check for it. Like, I go, is that realistic? And if it's an agreement, and then when I'm done, so I use this form here. I track agreements on this form. So you can see on the right-hand side, it's what are the, what's the agenda for the meeting? And then as agreements are made throughout the meeting, I have next action section down here where I put who said they were going to do what, and then who's accountable, and then by when, and then I go over that at the end of the meeting. So when you start to do this, you're going to find that people much more consistently keep their agreements and do what they say they're going to do. And it's like the magic bullet of accountability. And the other really cool thing that happens is when you start to implement this in your organization and your teams, you're going to find that it increases the level of trust among each other. And it's just a really awesome thing. So just want to go over what we've talked about in terms of how do you have conversations that produce consistent results? Well, put in position agreements in place that are clear about the results, not the tasks. Get team buy-in and agreement when you implement those position agreements so that they start to own it and they take ownership and responsibility for it. And you'll be amazed, like people will gravitate to wanting to do that because it lets them know that they've got a way of being able to win the game and be successful. And it's super important to understand that people fundamentally want to do a good job. People want to have a sense of belonging, mattering, and contribution with you. And so when we can set up position agreements that allows us to tap into that with people, it's just so powerful to building the kind of organization that great people want to work for, and that of people who take ownership and responsibility in whole new ways. So it's the process, and be patient with the process, do the process. And I'm going to give you an outline for writing position agreements that can help you along the way. And I talk about all those things in there. And then using the SMART acronym for managing agreements. When you're in meetings or you're in conversations or on the phone with somebody and somebody's making an agreement, use that little acronym as a way of going, hey, am I making a SMART agreement with this person? Is it specific, measurable, is there clear accountability? Is it realistic? And is it time driven? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to share with you, Mark, you'll have the 6 steps to writing a great position agreement. I'll share that with you. And then for Mark, for your guests, your listeners, I am offering my book, The Profit Bleed, How Managing Margin Can Save Your Contracting Business for Free. This is the book. All they have to do is pay $7.95 shipping and handling. So if you go to theprofitbleed.com/free, you can get it. And when you check out, check out the bundle of great tools and resources that I've developed over all these years that can help you implement some of these practices and systems and processes with your team so that you can produce more consistent results. And then I've got a webinar coming up that takes a little deeper dive into this topic on getting your team to take ownership. So that'll be coming up in March.
Well, that was fantastic, Vicki. I think that was very, very actionable. I think a lot of people are going to be downloading these forms and you're going to start putting pen to paper because those agreements, I'm sure, like you say, a lot of people have something, in writing, but is it vague? Is it general? Does it hit the mark? Right. So super, super interesting. Good. Yeah. Well, Vicki, I think we'll look to have you back at some point soon because I'm sure people are going to, implement this stuff and then there'll be questions coming up and, people are at the core of every business. And, I think it's people are seeing that today. You got to make more and more of an investment in your people if you want to keep them around and you want them to grow in the organization. And much like Beth with you, who stuck around for 10 years after you kind of figured it out, I think that's ultimately what people are after. Right? You want to build a great company, you got to bring along great people with you. So tools like this I see as being super impactful. So I'm happy and thankful that you took the time to share this with us today.
It is my pleasure.
The Academy members appreciate you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Mark. I really appreciate it. And if I could just say one other thing, I do have a course called Build Your Dream Team coming up that if anyone wants to know about it, it starts in March. You can check it out on my website.
Vicki, before we let you go, how should somebody get in contact with you directly if they wanted to?
They can reach me at Vicki@SuiterBusinessBuilders.com. It's VICKI at Suiter, SUITER, businessbuilders.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Vicki.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Take care. Bye-bye.